What I'm about to tell you is the single most traumatic event of mine and my ex-girlfriend's life. I'm writing this of my own volition, but I've had to seek permission from her in order to actually send this over with the intention of it being on broadcast. Her number one condition was that I tell the absolute truth about what happened and that whoever I send it over to is respectful in their reading of it. That being said, I would really appreciate it if you abided by her wishes. It would save me a heck of a lot of trouble if you did. And so with all of that out of the way, I guess it's on with the story. In 2011, me and Holly, my then girlfriend, not a real name, decided to head out on a day's hike in Northern California's Sayad Valley. Sayad Valley is situated along the Klamath River, near State Route 96, and is surrounded by the Klamath Mountains, with the Lower Devil's Peaks to the north and the Marble Mountains Wilderness to the south. The valley is home to a few hundred people at the most, with homes and cabins spread along the many creeks and roads, some of which are only accessible by dirt tracks which wind for many miles off the main roads. Another thing about Sayad Valley, and something I kind of wish that I knew before we visited, is that it was home to something called the Free State of Jefferson movement. From what I can recall, the movement started when local settlers found a bunch of gold and then wanted to form their own state outside of California and Oregon, so that they didn't have to pay taxes on it. I suppose that all sounds innocent enough at first. I mean, this country was founded on no taxation without representation. But then after the Civil War, the valley became home to all kinds of folks fixated on rebellion and anarchy, and not the innocent teenage kind. Although those first fugitive Confederates and other secessionists had all passed by the 1920s, the Sayad Valley retained its unwritten status as a place where outsiders and outlaws would retreat to or hide out in. And I, for one, at least in my own way, can confirm that's true. Holly and I arrived in the valley in the early afternoon. Then, after a bite to eat, we hiked up into the hills, intent on walking a looping trail that would lead us up near Kangaroo Mountain and Red Butte, and then back down towards the town. At first, it was everything we hoped it would be. It was a beautiful afternoon, the air was crisp and sweet with the scent of pine resin, and we were both enthusiastic over finding ourselves a new and very healthy hobby. It also gave us time to actually talk, and I mean really talk, because we were both in full-time employment by then, and with other varying commitments, opportunities for quality time together were becoming fewer and further between. About 3:30 p.m., we were panting our way up a very gentle slope, still having fun, but really starting to feel the burn when we came across something unexpected. We came across smaller connecting trails every so often. Sometimes we'd explore them and sometimes not. But in this one instance, we must have walked for maybe 100 meters before we came across an isolated log cabin, nestled in a small clearing and partially obscured by a thicket of bushes. It looked very quaint, almost picturesque, if not for the out-of-place truck parked haphazardly in front of it. Its driver's side door was wide open, as was the door of the cabin itself, and as we got closer, a man emerged from inside, walking at quite a very brisk pace. He was of average build, late 30s at the most, and when he saw us, he smiled and waved. "Morning, folks," I remember him saying. "You two are quite far off the beaten path, ain't you?" He seemed friendly enough, but his eyes scanned us a little too much. I told him that we were just out enjoying a hike, trying to keep the conversation light, and for a minute or two, we went back and forth about how nice the weather had been, among other very small talk. Then when I said something to the effect of, "Nice talking to you, but we're going to be hitting the trail again," he asked if we'd like to come inside for a cup of coffee. We very politely declined, saying how we were trying to stick to a schedule so we wouldn't have to drive back home at night. But the man wouldn't hear that. He walked down the cabin's dirt path towards us, saying stuff like, "Aw, come on now, it's no trouble at all. Not every day you get to meet someone out here, and you two look like you do with a pick-me-up." Again, we declined, but he became insistent, and instead of feeling welcoming, his insistence suddenly felt almost desperate, and as his tone shifted, so did the atmosphere. I glanced at Holly, seeing the same unease in her eyes, then hand in hand we began slowly backing away. But no sooner had we taken a couple of steps, the man reaches behind his back and produces a gun. Then, in a voice that was sharp and threatening, he told us, "Get inside, now." We hesitated, frozen to the spot with fear, but when he raised his gun and pointed it at us, we realized that we didn't have much of a choice but to do as he said. As we walked toward the cabin, he kept the gun trained on us, and then I remember as he got closer to the door, he yelled, "Hurry up! They'll be here any minute." After he slammed and locked the door behind us, Holly asked who he meant by they. She sounded so scared, but he completely ignored her question before he herded us into a corner and told us to sit on the floor. It was a stupid move, but I tried to show a modicum of courage by reiterating Holly's question. I said something like, Hey, she asked you a question." Then in an instant, he'd went from peering out the window to rushing over to me to smash the handle of his gun into my face. Holly's scream was gut-wrenching, but the man barked at her to shut up and for us to stop asking questions, and I felt blood running down my cheeks. The impact around my cheekbone burned, and Holly asked if she could help stop the bleeding, to which that guy replied, "What's the point? We're all gonna die soon here anyway. Might as well let it bleed." She tried to ignore what he said, but I could tell that it got to her. I could see the fear and helplessness in her eyes, and it tore me up. The man went back to peering out the cabin's window, twisting around to glare at us whenever we so much as moved or talked. Whole minutes stretched out to feel like hours as I simultaneously lied to Holly, saying that we were going to be fine, while scanning the room for escape routes, weapons, anything that may help in saving our lives, but I couldn't see anything. There was one way in and one way out, and if the guy got so much as a whiff that I was going to charge him with a candlestick or a piece of chopped log, he was going to gun me down before I even touched him. After that, it became a case of just trying not to panic, but the wait was agonizing. Every time he turned around and pointed the gun at us, I thought that that was it, that we were going to die. But each time, instead of pulling the trigger, he'd tell us to shut up, because he couldn't think straight with us whispering amongst ourselves. And I think we sat there for maybe an hour. I'm not 100% sure, but in that time, Holly and I worked out that they, the man spoke of, was probably the cops. Then, when we heard the sound of distant rotor blades, our suspicions were confirmed when the guy seemed to tense up, look out of the window, and mutter, "They're here," to himself. I think in any other situation the sound of the cops might have been a relief, and I guess that it was in some small way. But as those rotor blades got closer and we eventually started to hear what sounded like approaching vehicles, the guy turned to us and said, "If they come in here, you're dead. You better help make sure that doesn't happen." We agreed, but only out of terror, because any chance that we got to make it out of there or help the cops, we knew that we had to take it. Our very lives depended on it. As the sound of the helicopter got really close, we realized that heli was right above us, and then not long after, we started to hear shouted commands outside as some sort of SWAT team disembarked from their vehicles. The guy holding us prisoner got right up to the window and started yelling, "I got hostages! Come any closer and they're dead!" All he got in response was someone calling out over a loudspeaker, saying it was the police and he was to come out with his hands up. The man walked over to us, grabbed Holly, then dragged her towards the window while screaming, "Show your face! Show your face! I want them to see it when I blow it off!" She screamed and cried as he kept the end of the gun jammed in her face, and all I could do was keep telling her, "It's gonna be okay. Everything's gonna be okay, baby." The guy kept yelling out the window about how he was going to shoot Holly, and I'm guessing the cops started to back off or whatever once they saw her, because he started laughing, yelling stuff like, "That's right. That's what I thought. Back off. Go on, get." He dragged Holly back to the corner that I was in, then backed off quickly with the gun pointed at us. He started yelling something about how we were going to be his human shields if the cops burst in, but then the sound of something going on outside cut him off and he ran to the window again. We obviously couldn't see what was going on outside, but we could see that it made the guy furious. It sounded like a cop was shouting orders. Then the guy aimed his gun at the glass of the window and started firing on the cops outside. He fired until a few of their own bullets smashed into the window frame next to him. Then he retreated, turned the gun on me, and told me to kneel in the center of the room. I know this might sound like the understatement of the century, but I really did not want to comply. He was telling me to kneel, with my hands behind my back like some kind of execution stance, and since I knew that was probably the final step between me and the Almighty, I knew I had to do anything I could to prevent or to delay it. But that was the thing that made me feel sick, that made my legs feel like they were turning to jelly when I tried to stand. There was nothing I could do to prevent it other than outright refuse, in which case I was no use to him anymore and I was a dead man. It was like one of those catch-22s, damned if you do, damned if you don't. So I did what he asked, told Holly I loved her, and tried to prepare myself for what was to come. I somehow managed to make it from the corner to the center of the room without my legs collapsing under me. Then after I kneeled, I felt the guy push the end of the gun against the back of my head. He then started to scream at the door of the cabin, "You come in here, I'll kill him, you hear me? I'll blow his head off." It was about then that I realized the cops must have been advancing on the door of the cabin, and the final few moments before they burst inside were going to be the final few moments of my life. It might sound ultra-morbidly weird, but I became hyperfixated on the goal of not pissing my pants in front of Holly before I died. I myself find it bizarre in retrospect, but it's true. I thought something along the lines of, I didn't do anything to save her, so please God at least let me go out with some dignity. I squeezed my eyes shut as the screaming from inside and outside got louder and more intense, grinding my teeth together as the guy pushed the gun harder into the back of my skull. And then suddenly, there was a bang, then another, and I fell forward onto the ground of the cabin, quite certain that I was dead, my ears ringing. But obviously, I wasn't. It just took me a minute to realize it thanks to the debilitating terror I was absolutely in the grip of. And when I finally opened my eyes and looked up, the man was on the floor trying to suck air into his lungs. But thanks to the bullets put there by the SWAT team as they burst in, he was having a really hard time doing so. I remember just staring at him for a moment, watching him slowly die as the sound came back to my ears. Not in a sort of, "ha ha, you got yours, buddy," but just kind of in complete disbelief. One moment, he'd been the master of my life. The next, I was watching him breathe his last breath. One of the SWAT said something like, "You okay? You hurt?" And I was so sure that I replied to him verbally, but he ended up tapping me on the shoulder, sort of like, "Hey, you hear me?" Because I must have just carried on watching my would-be murderer gargling on his own blood, lost in some total daze. And miraculously, and this is obviously aside from the cut on my face, neither me nor Holly were hurt, and after the SWAT team cleared the area surrounding the cabin, we were driven back into town and given a statement, and then we were free to leave. It took a while before I felt like I could drive again, so I sat there, leaning over from the driver's seat trying to console Holly as she alternated between gentle sobs and very ugly wails. I cried too, I won't lie, out of this weird mix of trauma, but mainly relief. We made it, but I think we both knew it was something we'd carry with us for the rest of our lives. When we were ready, we got back on the road and we didn't stop until we were back in Reading. I stayed overnight in her apartment, wrapped up in blankets, just feeling sort of numb after such a horrifying and very surreal experience. We stayed together for a few years after that and then broke up in early 2014. It was very amicable, and although we both lived in different cities, we make an effort to keep in touch and have the occasional catch-up via FaceTime. We don't just catch up either. We always talk about what happened that day in Syad Valley. I don't really make a point to do so either. It just inevitably comes up throughout the natural course of our conversations. I never got into the whole therapy thing, but Holly did. And even she said talking to someone that understands is 1,000 times better than talking to someone who, no matter how many diplomas they have on the wall, wasn't there to see it, and wasn't there to feel it. My name is Rachel. I'm from Los Angeles and have recently discovered your Spotify podcast, and I think I have a story for you and your listeners. You see, back in 2013, I read a book called Wild by Cheryl Strayed. It's all about how the author's life fell apart after the death of her mom and how she used hiking to get herself sober and put her life back together. Most of the book takes place on the Pacific Crest Trail, with the physical challenges prompting the author to have a series of realizations about her life, and to me, it was like the hardship of walking 1,000 miles of trail allowed her to unlock some kind of untapped source of ancient collective wisdom. I was 22 when I first read it, and honestly it spoke to me more than any piece of art or literature had before. I wanted that same kind of clarity, that innate wisdom to know what did and didn't matter in life. I just didn't think that I had it in me to go hiking the PCT all alone. That all changed around 2016, when the hiking bug finally bit me and I started planning my own hiking trip along the Pacific Crest Trail to try and capture the same kind of magic I read about in Wild. Since I couldn't afford to spend too much time away from work, I decided to hike a 5-night stretch of trail near a place called Tehachapi, on the far western edges of the Mojave Desert. I chose this area for 3 reasons. First, I love the section of the book where Cheryl writes about the region. Secondly, I could easily drive there, and thirdly, I was admittedly very intimidated by the prospect of hiking the more northern sections of the trail in the fall or winter. It was my first time doing anything remotely outdoorsy, and having heard the horror stories regarding mishaps and accidents, I didn't want to run before I could hike. Please laugh at that. So it was 5 nights in Southern California just to get a taste of what Cheryl Strayed had written about. On day 1, I drove out to Tehachapi really early, then found the RV park that I'd arranged to leave my car at for the next few days. Then, it was 9 miles of hiking towards a place called Twin Oaks, and let me tell you, after all day trudging along in the heat, it was still sweltering even in the early fall, I was desperate to reach Lake Isabella the next day. I'd read that since all the water was coming down from the high Sierra, the creek could be unpleasantly cold at certain times of the year. They wrote it like it was a warning, but the idea of getting to cool off, that seemed almost heavenly after that first day's hike. The next morning, I was faced with a 20-mile hike from Twin Oaks to Lake Isabella on what I'd like to call my challenge day. The 9 miles of the first day was intended as a kind of warm-up, something manageable so I could get used to the pacing, the terrain, and navigation. But the second day, my challenge day, was where I'd really try to replicate the grueling pace of Cheryl Strayed's journey in Wild. But frankly, I couldn't have picked a worse stretch of terrain. The second day's hike required to hike up and out of a valley which was hell on my legs, which were still totally unaccustomed to that level of exertion. The only real relief came from the shade of the trees as I walked through the chaparrals and finally at the waters of Lake Isabella, where I was so tired I was on the verge of nodding out by around 9:30 that night. The next morning, I woke up sore, tired, and cursing myself for having totally overextended myself. I was faced with another 13 miles, which was laid out over much easier terrain, but by then, I was so tired that I wasn't sure if I could make it in time. My goal was to camp near the Sugarloaf Mountain campground, as I knew there'd be a lot of amenities there that I'd be sorely in need of by the end of day 3. But the 20 miles of the previous day felt like it almost killed me, so being faced with a similar distance that third day was intimidating, to say the least. Hiking across the open desert near Isabella was tiring but simple, as the trail in front of me was easy to stick to. But then towards the afternoon, as I started up into the hills, I began hitting these patches of forest where the trail wasn't nearly as well defined. At one point, I walked off the trail just a little to take a bathroom break, then when I returned, I thought I was heading down the same trail that I'd just been walking on. But after around 10 to 15 minutes, the trail opened up into a dirt road and I realized that it was taking me off the PCT and down towards Wofford Heights. I decided to take the opportunity to stop, drink a little water, and check over my map just to ensure that I hit the right trail upon heading back. I thought I was alone, like literally there wasn't a soul in sight. But then, as I was focused on studying my map book, the sound of a man's voice suddenly startled me. All he said was, "Hi there," in a cheerful, friendly voice, and when he saw that he'd startled me, we both kind of laughed it off as he apologized. He was a short, tanned man in a vest, shorts and sandals with a sandy-colored bush hat atop his head, and he introduced himself as Alan, said he lived down the path in a home closer to the highway, and added that he often ran into hikers during his own walks up in the hills. Since he was out on a short afternoon constitutional, his actual choice of word, he offered to walk me back toward the trail, then direct me onto the path which would take me to Sugarloaf Campground. He was a warm and very friendly person, so I figured, why not? And then we began walking at a leisurely pace back toward the trail. Alan and I talked a little bit about what I was doing out there, as well as why I was doing it. He said he thought it was really cool that a book had inspired me to head off on a real-life adventure, and told me that in his youth, he'd always wanted to head off on some cross-country road trip after reading Jack Kerouac's On the Road Again. He also said that I'd picked a great stretch of trail to get to grips with, that it was a little challenging for a beginner maybe, but that I should be proud of myself for making it that far without collapsing or giving up. At the time, his praise meant the world to me, and I guess Alan will always have a special place in my heart for that reason. But, as I'm very sorry to say, my memory of the man is somewhat tainted by the warning he gave me. It was a warning that, in hindsight, I'm very appreciative of, but the memory of him and what came next on my little soul-searching adventure are frighteningly inextricable. Alan told me that the wilderness between Black Mountain and Sugarloaf Mountain was some of the wildest in America. Although officially speaking, it was state land that no one but park rangers could build houses on, but unofficially, the hills north of Alta Sierra were home to a very unusual and extroverted person, and his name was Old Ben. Alan said Old Ben was a hermit, that he'd been living out there for as long as anyone could remember, and although he was an eccentric old recluse, he was harmless and had never been known to hurt anybody. I can't remember the exact words he used, but as soon as Alan said the thing about Old Ben having never hurt anyone, I was kind of on edge. I mean, it was a very loaded statement, right? Why even bring it up at all? I asked Alan what exactly he meant by eccentric, if he had to follow up with such a weighty reassurance. Then, in so many words, he told me it was a very long and very complicated story, and one unworthy of telling since I probably wouldn't even bump into Old Ben in the first place. But on the rare chance that I did just so happen to run into him, I was to rest assured that he posed no threat to me whatsoever. Again, I couldn't help but feel the very opposite of reassured by what Alan was telling me, but at the same time, I was not without protection. Securing a permit to carry a concealed firearm on the California section of the PCT involved navigating a complex web of state and local regulations. I began researching California's concealed carry laws and then applied through the San Diego Sheriff's Office by submitting proof of residency and some photos before completing a firearms training course. And after that, I had to submit an online application and had to pass a live fire qualification for my listed firearms. Then it was just a case of waiting for the background check to be finished before I could finally pick up my license. Once all that was over and done with, I had to familiarize myself with the PCT-specific regulations regarding firearms because, to be perfectly honest, there was no way I was going to head out there in the ass end of nowhere without being able to properly defend myself. On the advice of a store owner, I picked up a Sig Sauer P365, and it's been my hiking companion ever since. Since I had my Sig in my backpack, I most certainly knew how to use it. I wasn't overly afraid of running into some kooky old hermit, no matter how weird he was. But as you can imagine, I was still a little apprehensive, and after Alan and I parted ways, you can bet my head was on a swivel as I hiked up into the pine-covered hills. I made good time during that second half of the day's journey, and by the time I started to see signs of Sugarloaf, I figured that I'd stop for a while, take a rest, and take on some water. I think it was water that most effectively wore down that spiritual barrier and made me appreciate being alive, even if it was by just a small, somewhat undramatic measure. Taking a sip of cold water after hiking through the sun-baked hills all afternoon was like a religious experience, and unlike a lot of things that you develop a tolerance to, quenching my thirst only felt more satisfying with every dusty mile I covered. It felt incredible to just stop, take a load off, and enjoy a cool sip of water, all while enjoying the peace and tranquility of some of the last untouched areas of wilderness in the country. And then, I saw him. Maybe 50 to 60 yards away, off the trail and through the pines, I saw a lone figure slowly stepping out from behind a tree trunk. It looked like he was wearing some kind of camouflage outfit, matching pants, and long-sleeve shirt in muddy browns and greens. I could also see from that distance that his hair and beard were long, filthy, and bushy, so much so that there wasn't much of a face for me to look back at. Just a small, grubby triangle beneath whiskers and bangs, which did a good job of concealing his eyes, too. I knew who it was right away, purely based on the fact that he stood still as a statue and simply stared at me. He knew I was looking right back at him, too. He must have known, and it didn't seem to bother him in the slightest. It was old Ben. It had to be. And even though I was nervous as hell, I raised an arm and waved at him. Old Ben watched me as I gave him what was probably the most awkward wave ever. Then, when I was done, he kept on staring for maybe a minute more. But then suddenly, he raised his own arm and returned my awkward wave, but not in his own way. He was mimicking me, kind of, and very crudely, too. I literally couldn't tell if he was doing it to make fun of me or if it was him sort of, I don't know, trying to return my energy. Either way, I didn't take offense, and I was nervous as hell anyway, so I had no idea what else to do other than just try and talk to him. And so that's what I did. I called out, "You're old Ben, right?" He didn't say anything at first. Then I saw him shift a little before he yelled back, You're old Ben, right?" With the exact same tone and enunciation as I said it. Again, it didn't overtly sound like he was trying to make fun of me, but the way he mimicked my voice was extremely unsettling. I don't really know if I can properly describe it, but it was almost like he'd forgotten how to talk, and he was mimicking the sounds that I was making because they were all he could remember. I know that might sound crazy, but I honestly don't know how else to describe it. He wasn't aggressive, he didn't start approaching me or anything, he just mimicked everything I did that was directed at him while staring at me through those curtains of grimy, dark brown hair. He did the same thing when I got up and put away my water bottle and said, "I'm gonna go now, okay?" Only he fully waited until my back was turned and was walking off down the trail before unleashing this creepy, almost squeaky sort of, "I'm gonna go now, okay?" I was totally expecting him to do it, but it still made me jump just a little to hear it, and when I turned to give him one final wave, I didn't say anything extra, and I didn't look back. As I walked, I kept on looking over my left shoulder to where I'd seen him through the trees, and I think I only went maybe half a mile tops before I unshouldered my pack and retrieved my cig. I grabbed the magazine, checked the chamber, loaded it up, and then pulled back the release, and in an instant, I felt a little more secure. Alan had assured me that he was no threat, but after that first interaction, I definitely understood why people thought they were in danger whenever they ran into old Ben. The way he behaved made my skin crawl, and while I was sure that sensation subsided once you got to know him a little, I was very much in the I don't want to know you at all camp when it came to old Ben and his creepy mimicry. With my cig in my pocket and still looking over my shoulder every so often, I made it a few more miles up the trail towards Sugarloaf Mountain. The fact that there were multiple campgrounds out there made me think that there'd be at least a handful of modern amenities, be it a store, some camp showers, or even just a bathroom. But there was nothing. Absolutely nothing but a few clearings marked by some rotten signage. Never again did I make that same mistake, and I always properly researched my campgrounds from then on. But I still had to learn the hard way on that first trip along the trail, and let me tell you, it sucked. I was tired, I felt gross from being so unwashed, and I was dreading the inevitable squat in the woods that I was going to have to take if I dared drink a cup of instant coffee after dinner. And that was probably one of the lowest points of the hike for me, where I started to kind of question what the hell I was doing. But eating, giving myself a wet wipe shower, and finally doing my business after a few days of holding it really raised my morale, and by the time I was setting up my tent for another night of well-earned rest, I felt like I was living the dream. It's amazing what a few chocolate chew bars and a good poop can do for a girl's spirits, but before I planned on crawling into my tent for the night, I figured that I'd sit by my campfire and soak in the atmosphere of the woods. I hadn't forgotten about the encounter with old Ben, but with my cig at the ready, I felt safe enough to relax, at least as much as it's possible to relax when you're all alone in the woods at night. As time ticked by and I started to grow more and more at ease, I remember how serene and timeless it all felt. Sitting by the warmth of the fire as the flames danced and crackled, listening to the chirp of the crickets as the deep blue twilight ebbed away and a twinkling darkness took hold above. It felt beautifully primitive, like I was reconnecting with something lost while bringing the pages of my favorite book to life. I remember thinking, so this is what it feels like, and smiling. Then maybe a second or two later, that smile was wiped from my face when I heard the sound of some shifting in the darkness in front of me. It was clearly and very audibly distinct from the sounds of fire or surrounding wildlife. I'd grown used to the crackle and snaps of burning wood or the frenzied scurrying of an animal rushing through the undergrowth. But what I heard in that moment was unmistakable. A slow, deliberate footfall, the sound of foliage gently crunching underfoot. I tensed up, my eyes darting to where I thought the sound had come from. It was right in front of me, maybe just a few feet into the darkness beyond the orange glow of the campfire. Ben? Is that you? There was a silence for a few seconds, then the sound of another soft footfall in the darkness ahead, and I reached for my cig, and my tone got less friendly. Ben, I said, I don't appreciate unwanted guests. I'm asking you nicely. Leave me alone. I listened for his response, but I only heard crackling of the fire. I asked if he could hear me, sitting up as I gripped my pistol and then hearing him suddenly parrot with a very squeaky, "Can you hear me, Ben?" It was one of the weirdest moments of my life. I've never been so relieved and so not relieved at the same time. 'Cause while better the devil you know, it's still a devil. And besides, I didn't even really know old Ben and all, but since he didn't know me either, I figured maybe that was the issue. He didn't step into the firelight, he just stayed out of view in the darkness, but I knew that he was still there. It was like I could feel him. Alan had mentioned something about old Ben feeling a sense of ownership over the land, and how that was partly the reason why he'd make himself known to people in the way that he did. So I figured maybe just telling him what I was up to would placate him into leaving me alone. "Hey, Ben?" I said. "Hey, Ben?" came the reply, instantly this time. I've been out hiking, and I didn't know that you lived here," I said. "But tomorrow I'm heading back the way I came, so you don't have to worry about seeing me around, okay?" There was silence. I figured he was about to mimic me right away, but he didn't. He stayed quiet, so I kept talking. "I heard you like to pay visits to people, but I'd appreciate it if you just left me alone so I could get some sleep. I got a long day ahead of me, and..." That was as far as I got before I heard him say something, or more like wheeze or hiss something back at me through the darkness. He said, "Worry about seeing me?" Still kind of mimicking the way I said it, but drawing it out very breathy, like he was feeling out the words through saying them. I felt an actual shiver run down my spine from how creepy he sounded as he talked, and the sound alone was enough to silence me for what felt like a full minute after he stopped. I was terrified. I started to think that I could see him, that my eyes were adjusting from staring into the darkness at where I thought he was. He looked hunched over, body right up against a tree like he had an arm around it, but he was still just a shape in the darkness. "Ben," I remember saying, "I'm gonna head inside my tent now, and I'd like you to leave. I have a gun, and I really don't want you to put me in a position where I feel like I have to use it." I remember feeling this brief swell of bravery after mentioning my pistol, but I was amazed how quickly it was snuffed out by the voices in my own head asking, "What if you miss? What if he's fast? What if you can't?" He didn't say anything in response to what I guess amounted to my threat, and part of me thinks that's because he understood it. But if he did, he showed no sign of doing so, and as the seconds ticked by in almost complete silence, I realized that there was no way in hell I was about to stand up and turn my back on this guy, and it was only then that it really hit me just how quiet he'd been during his approach. He'd gotten within maybe 10 to 15 feet of me in almost total silence, and hadn't noticed until it was almost too late to do anything about it. And that's when I realized, or when the thought occurred to me, that Ben was so sneaky and silent because he wasn't wearing any shoes or boots. I told him again that I'd like for him to leave, and then just kind of put my pistol on my lap, holding it just so he could see it, and then after softly mimicking me saying, "I'd like for you to leave," I told him again that I'd like for him to leave, then just kind of put my pistol on my lap, holding it just so he could see it, then after softly mimicking me saying, "I'd like for you to leave," I heard him turn. Then his soft footfalls grew quieter and quieter as he walked off into the darkness. I think I breathed the biggest sigh of relief of my whole entire life as I heard his footsteps fade into silence, and I think if it hadn't been for that guy Alan telling me that old Ben was harmless, I think I might have been scared enough to just open fire on him. But something kept that thought from my mind and meant all I did was issue a verbal warning when I was so scared I think a warning shot might have been more fitting. The way he said, "worry about seeing me," it was like he'd picked those words out from what I'd said to him, remembering what they meant. He sent them right back at me as a warning. To this day, I don't know if that's 100% accurate. I have no idea what was going through his mind, but the thought bothered me enough that for at least an hour, I toyed with the idea of packing up and heading back the way I came. The only things that stopped me were the exhaustion, and knowing that I had my pistol with me so that if Ben decided to make me the first person he ever tried hurting, he wouldn't do so without catching some hurt of his own. I can't remember falling asleep, but I do remember waking up to the sound of tree branches rattling outside my tent. Something was climbing a nearby tree, that much was clear to my half-asleep brain as it booted up. The only question was it old Ben? And if not, what was it? I sat up, gun in hand, and just listened for a minute or so as whatever it was scrambled higher and higher until it sounded like the noise was coming from right above me. There was a little more rustling and creaking as whatever it was kept moving through the trees above me, and then it stopped. I had a pretty good idea that it wasn't a bear. Bears make bear noises, and you hear their claws scratching against the bark when they climb trees. Heck, it was my first time in the woods, and I knew enough to know that. No, I knew who it was. It was old Ben. And from the way he was moving, he was trying not to wake me. I was scared. Very scared, but unlike the first two encounters, I was actually kind of mad during that third one, so I decided to give him another warning. I told him, "Ben, you come near this entrance to my tent, I will shoot you." And there was a pause, and as you can expect, he whispered back, "Come near." And I felt that flush of anger again, that made a point of unloading and reloading my pistol, pulling back the slide with a very satisfying loud ch-chunk, as if to illustrate that I was serious. I wanted to leave, I really did. But the idea of packing up all my stuff while Ben was perched above me in a tree, well, let's just say that meant that the most attractive option was staying put with my pistol at the ready. And Ben stayed quiet above me for a few minutes, to the point that I wouldn't even have known that he was there if I hadn't heard him climbing that tree. And so, against my better judgment, I decided to lay back down and see if I could rest my eyes. I knew for a fact that if he so much as scratched up there, I'd hear it and it'd put me on edge. So I leaned back down and rested my head on my little pillow that I'd made out of my pack and felt myself become trapped in this limbo between simultaneously needing to sleep but not being able to. Every time I even got close to thinking I might be able to pass out, a little voice in my head would say, "He's still above you, up in that tree, and he's waiting for you to fall asleep." I immediately opened my eyes very wide, blinked them a few times, and take a deep breath and grip my gun a little tighter. And it went on like that for hours, and thankfully, very little else happened that night. Old Ben stayed up in that tree, I think, keeping quiet for the most part, and then he kinda slinked off just before dawn as quietly as he'd arrived. But there was one thing that he did maybe an hour or so before he moved on that'll stay with me for as long as I live. At one point, I heard something like heavy breathing coming from above me, so I was thinking, oh God, what is he about to do? I thought Ben might have been whispering something at first, but then as he got a little louder, I caught just a hint of melody to his voice and realized this freak was singing. I couldn't make out 90% of what he sang, but there was one part, I'm guessing the chorus, that kept looping over and over, meaning I slowly got to piece together one of the lyrics to his little song. I say his little song because I later Googled these lyrics and nothing matched, so who knows if it's a tune that's been lost to time or something he just made up, but either way, it creeped me the hell out. He sang, "I'm just a little sleepwalker walking in my sleep, and I'm dreaming, dreaming, dreaming of that girl I'm gonna keep." Then he moved back to something else I couldn't hear, and he kept on going for 20 or 30 minutes, maybe before he finally went quiet again. And all I could think was, I'm not gonna be that girl, Ben. And for a moment I debated saying that out loud, but I didn't because I knew exactly what his response would be. He'd say, "Be that girl," pluck out my own words and use them against me, and I knew it'd make my skin crawl if he did, so I just kept my mouth shut. After old Ben climbed out of his tree and crept off into what little remained of that darkness, I waited until the blue light of dawn started to creep into the forest before unzipping my tent and peeking outside. I wanted to be 110% sure that he was gone, that he wasn't just watching from a distance and waiting for me to let my guard down. I kept my gun handy as I dismantled my tent and packed all my stuff away, checking over my shoulder and scanning my surroundings maybe every 30 seconds or so. Every time I'd focus on my task for a little too long, that little voice would pop into my head again. "He's behind you. He's creeping up behind you. He's going to get you." And the thought would crawl back through my mind, then I'd spin my head around and breathe a huge sigh of relief when I saw that I was still alone. And that carried on until everything was packed away. Then, unlike the first couple of days, I walked away from Sugarloaf Mountain with my gun openly in my hand. I didn't give a good goddamn who saw me, because if anyone objected, I'd just simply make it clear that some inbred hick psycho was stalking me while singing about keeping me. I mean, I'm sorry to be rude, but how much am I supposed to take without just getting mad and resenting him? By that point, I kinda didn't believe old Creep had never hurt anyone, and if that was true, I genuinely believed another night there would have resulted in him making me his first victim. The hike back towards where my car was parked involved 2 more nights in the woods, but as soon as Lake Isabella Town came into view, I realized that I had absolutely no desire to risk camping out in the woods when I had some perfectly good motels right there. I figured I could take a shower, spend the night in a soft bed, then catch a bus down the highway a little before getting back on the trail so I could spend my last night near Twin Oaks as I'd planned. Old Ben would have been one hell of a tracker to follow me all that way, but even so, I was out of his territory. So I figured even if I'd hiked, maybe he'd just have left me be. But in a way, that really was just wishful thinking on my part, I suppose. I'm not going to dress it up like he got into my hotel room and then blue ball y'all by saying, but it was all a dream. But I did dream about him. Or rather, more of a nightmare, I guess. I dreamt that I woke up because I heard him singing that creepy little song. I'm just a sleepwalker walking in my sleep, and I'm dreaming of that girl I'm gonna keep. I woke up startled, exhausted, and disoriented that I really did think old Ben was in the room with me for a second, and I was back in that tent. If there was anyone checked into the room next to me that night, they probably heard one hell of a scream at around 3 a.m. in the morning, and if that was any of you listening staying in the Lakeview Motel that night, then I sincerely apologize for frightening you. And thankfully, I didn't have any creepy nightmares when I slept in my tent at Twin Oaks. I slept rather soundly through that night. But that doesn't mean old Ben wasn't on my mind as I made my campfire and settled in for the evening. In fact, every single time I went hiking since that first fateful trip, memories of old Ben have revisited me every time the evening sun sinks low and the sounds of the crickets in my campfire start to sound a little too relaxing. Then whenever I do, I always remember that little song that he kind of half whispered and he half sang. I'm just a sleepwalker walking in my sleep, dreaming of that girl I'm gonna keep. And I think, not me, old Ben. Not me. A few years back, a few friends and I decided on some hiking and a night of camping on the Pacific Crest Trail. And although I remember that weekend vividly, a part of me wishes that I could erase it from my memory. It was meant to be an easygoing day out on the trails, just me and 2 friends setting off after having planned it for weeks. And that first day was as close to perfection as you could get. We were excited to hang out, have a few beers, and escape the grind of everyday life for a few days. We spent hours walking, sharing laughs, stories, and the occasional friendly argument over who the goated 49ers quarterback was. And then, when we found a decent spot to camp, near enough to a water source, a shallow but fast-moving stream, we pitched our tents and got to work making a campfire. While the boys were working on the fire, I decided to head down to the stream to freshen up. And to put it bluntly, it had been a very sweaty day, so I took off my shirt, watch, and chain and rinsed off my shirt in the water and then used it as a kind of washcloth to rinse off the top half and my junk. I was maybe 99% sure that I'd slid my watch into my pocket, but when I got back to camp and reached into my pocket, it wasn't there. I retraced my steps back to the stream, keeping my eyes glued on the ground the whole time, but I couldn't find it anywhere. It wasn't like an expensive watch or anything, so it didn't ruin the trip for me, but I was still kind of wondering, where the hell did my watch go? Before eventually deciding the strap must have caught on the edge of my pocket before it dropped into the water while I was leaning over into the stream. I mean, it sucks, but that's life, right? Now anyway, the rest of our trip went smoothly. Nothing happened that night. Then the next morning, we packed up and walked back down the trail towards where my friend's car was parked. We get right to the end of the trail, less than 100 yards or so from the parking lot, and one of my friends sees something hanging from a branch just up ahead of us. He said something out of the blue, sort of like, "Dude, what is that?" Then I looked up and saw it. It was my watch, tied loosely around the branch of a tree, just sort of hanging there for all to see. The friend who saw it turned back and said something like, "Dude, can you imagine if that was the one you lost?" But when he saw the look of surprise and elation on my face, he realized the same thing I did, that it actually was my watch, and that some kind of stranger had left it there on the off chance that its owner would spot it upon leaving the trail. We're thinking, dude, what are the chances? And then a second later, my two friends are stepping out of the way so I can take a running jump to grab my watch off the branch, because it was maybe a foot or two above head height. Then a hop, skip, and a jump later, I'm grabbing my watch in midair and pulling it down off the flimsy-ish branch that held it. But then, the second my fingers touched it, I knew something was wrong. After I landed down on my feet, I immediately let go of the watch and watched it drop to the ground. It was covered in a thick, translucent slime that shimmered unnaturally in the daylight, and the texture was all wrong too. It felt weirdly sticky, very unnaturally cold, colder than anything around it should be anyway. It was on my fingers too, clinging to them, so I immediately start wiping them on the first patch of grass that I see, exclaiming how gross it is. Now I know what some of you are going to be thinking at this point, that the weird slime on my watch was something that it wasn't, but I can assure you in the most polite and very sterile manner possible that it was not the thing that you're thinking of. I say this because my two friends immediately started joking around that it was, and while sure that was mildly amusing at the time, it didn't answer the question of what was actually on my watch. One of them suggested it was some kind of tree sap, and I responded, "Ew, no, it's not tree sap, touch it." But as you can probably guess, he didn't think that was such a hot idea. It was then a question of, if it was covered in that slime, who the hell put it there for it to be covered in that stuff? It wasn't Vaseline, and it smelled gross and dank too, so it definitely wasn't some kind of hair or beauty product. I washed my fingers off with some water from my bottle and then considered trying to wash my watch off too, till I realized that I actually really didn't want it anymore. And by that stage, all the good energy had been sapped away from us, and I was this sort of mix of grossed out, freaked out, and actually kind of frightened too. If it was a prank, then that's fine. I think I'd actually rather it was just another group of hikers who decided to balance playing good Samaritans by pranking us too. But then the alternatives, I don't even really want to think about it. And as we walked back to the car and drove back home, the mood had shifted completely. Each of us was caught up in our own speculation and discomfort, and I couldn't shake the image of that watch from my mind. Back at home, I tried to rationalize what we'd seen. I researched, looking into any natural phenomena that could explain that slime, but found nothing conclusive. It wasn't just the watch that bothered me, though, or the slime. It was the feeling that we brushed against something that, I don't know, maybe shouldn't exist. Months passed, and the memory of that weekend began to fade into the background of everyday life, but every so often, when I'd see a similar watch or hear about strange activity or someone going missing in the woods, my mind would snap back to that section of the PCT. I've since gone on other hikes, but I never felt that same peace. There's always a part of me that's looking and waiting for something out of the ordinary. The PCT has always been a place of beauty and escape, but now I feel like there's this undertone of apprehension every time I'm there. Because that watch, dripping with that unknown slime put there by God knows who and taken from me through God knows how, is just sort of a tiny little glimpse into the mysteries that might lurk in the places that we only think we know. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. EST, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links are all down in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember to bounce on it harder.